If your mind tonight feels like a weight pressing on your chest, filled with memories you wish you could change, words you wish you'd said differently, choices that still echo in your quiet moments, take a deep breath. Let your shoulders drop. Unclench your jaw. You are not alone in this feeling. Regret is perhaps the most human of all emotions, the one that keeps us tethered to moments that no longer exist except in the chambers of our hearts. If you find comfort in this space and wish to return here for rest and wisdom, I invite you to subscribe to our community, a sanctuary for those seeking peace with their past. Let us know in the comments where you are listening from tonight and what you hope to release. There was once a monk named Anzan who carried a smooth river stone in the pocket of his robe. For 20 years, he kept this stone with him through every season, every meditation, every teaching. The other monks noticed, of course, but in the tradition of Zen, they did not ask, they simply observed. Some thought it was a meditation tool. Others wondered if it held some sacred significance. But Anzan never spoke of it, and the stone remained his silent companion through 2 decades of monastic life. One autumn evening, as the maple leaves fell like whispered prayers around the temple grounds, a young novice finally gathered the courage to approach Anzan. The old monk was sitting by the koi pond, watching the water's surface catch the last light of day. The novice bowed respectfully and asked, "Master Anzan, forgive my curiosity, but I have noticed you carry a stone. For all the years I have known you, that stone has been your constant companion. What is its meaning?" Anzan reached into his robe and pulled out the stone. It was grey and worn smooth by water, unremarkable in every way except for the care with which it was obviously kept. He held it up to the fading light, turning it slowly in his weathered fingers. "This stone," he said softly, "is my regret." The novice's eyes widened. "Your regret, master?" 20 years ago, Anzan continued, I spoke harshly to my younger brother. We argued over something so trivial I can barely remember the details now. Perhaps it was about our father's land, or a debt, or some imagined slight. But I remember the look in his eyes when I turned my back on him. I remember the sharp words I threw like stones. 3 days later, he died suddenly. A fever took him in the night. I never had the chance to apologize, to take back those words, to tell him I loved him. The novice sat down beside his teacher, silent in the face of such confession. The koi moved beneath the water's surface like shadows of things that once were. "I found this stone by the river where we used to play as children," Anzan said. "I picked it up on the day of his funeral, and I have carried it ever since. Every day I hold this stone and remember my failure. Every day I feel the weight of words I cannot unsay. This stone is my punishment, my reminder, my regret made physical." The novice felt tears forming. "But master, you are known throughout the region for your wisdom and compassion. How can you still carry such pain?" Anzan smiled, but it was a smile tinged with something the novice couldn't quite name. "That is the question I have been asking myself for 20 years. They sat together as darkness gathered around them. The temple bell rang for evening meditation, its sound rolling across the hills like a question searching for its answer. Finally, Anzan stood, his old knees creaking slightly. He walked to the edge of the pond and held the stone out over the water. "For 20 years, I have carried this weight," he said. "I told myself it was honor, that it was love, that it was remembrance. But tonight, speaking to you, I hear my own words as if for the first time. I have been carrying a stone, just a stone. The weight is real, but the burden is one I chose." With a motion, both gentle and decisive, he opened his fingers. The stone fell, breaking the pond's surface with a small splash. Ripples spread outward in perfect circles, distorting the reflection of the rising moon. The koi scattered, then regrouped, continuing their eternal circling. "My brother is not in that stone," Anzan said quietly. My love for him is not in that stone. My guilt is not in that stone. There is only a stone, now at the bottom of a pond, returning to the mud from which all things come and to which all things return. The novice watched his master's face, seeing something shift in the old monk's expression. A lightness, perhaps, or the release of a breath held too long. But master, the novice asked, does this mean we should simply forget those we have wronged? Should we not remember our mistakes? Remember? Anzan turned to face his student. I will remember my brother every day of my life. I will remember the sound of his laugh, the way he threw stones across the river trying to beat my distance, the kindness in his eyes. I will remember our argument too, and the lessons it taught me about the power of words, about the fragility of time, about the importance of speaking love while we still can. But there is a difference between remembering and carrying. There is a difference between learning from the past and living in it. They walked back toward the temple together, the older monk's hand resting briefly on the younger one's shoulder. Regret, Anzan said, is the mind's way of wishing the past were different. But the past is not different. It is exactly what it was. No amount of guilt, no amount of suffering, no amount of carrying stones will change a single moment of what has already been. The only question is this: will we let what was determine what is? Will we let yesterday steal today? Inside the meditation hall, candles flickered in their rows, each flame a small defiance against the dark. The monks gathered in silence, settling onto their cushions with the practiced ease of ritual. Anzan took his place, and for the first time in 20 years, his robe pocket was empty. His hands rested lightly on his knees, and if the other monks noticed any change in him, they gave no sign. But the novice, watching from his place in the back row, saw something different in his teacher's posture. A straightness, perhaps, or simply the absence of a weight that had been carried too long. The Buddha taught that attachment is the root of suffering, but he might have added that regret is attachment to what no longer exists. We cling to our past mistakes with a ferocity that would be admirable if it weren't so destructive. We replay conversations, reimagine decisions, reconstruct moments we think we should have handled differently. We become architects of alternative pasts, building elaborate structures of what if and if only, while the present moment, the only moment we actually possess, slips through our fingers like sand. There is a teaching in the Buddhist tradition about the two arrows. When we experience pain, that is the first arrow, the actual event, the mistake, the loss, the regret. This arrow is unavoidable. Life shoots these arrows at all of us. But then we pick up a second arrow and shoot ourselves with it. This second arrow is our reaction to the first. Our guilt, our shame, our endless rumination, our refusal to let the wound heal. The first arrow hurts. The second arrow is the one that keeps us suffering long after the initial wound has the potential to heal. Consider the story of Meiho, a nun who lived in a small temple on the edge of a village. Meiho had once been married, had once been a mother. She had lived an ordinary life until one winter day when she left her young daughter by the hearth while she went to draw water from the well. She was gone only minutes, but minutes were enough. A log rolled from the fire, catching the edge of a blanket. By the time Meiho returned, the smoke was already thick. She pulled her daughter from the flames, but the child's burns were too severe. 3 days later, cradled in her mother's arms, the little girl died. Meiho's husband, mad with grief, blamed her. The village, in its cruelty, agreed. She was the mother. She should have been more careful. She should have stayed. She should have. The words became her constant companions, whispered behind hands, shouted in her husband's rage, and worst of all, screamed in her own mind during the endless nights that followed. Unable to bear the weight of her community's judgment and her own crushing guilt, Meiho left everything behind. She shaved her head, took vows, and entered a temple far from her village. She thought perhaps in spiritual practice she might find some way to atone, some path to redemption, some method to travel back through time and make a different choice. For years, she was the most dedicated practitioner in the temple. She rose before dawn, meditated longer than anyone, took on the most menial tasks, ate the smallest portions. She was trying, through sheer force of devotion, to earn the right to forgive herself. But forgiveness, she discovered, does not work that way. No amount of self-punishment could bring her daughter back. No degree of spiritual practice could change what had happened. The past remained exactly as it was, impervious to her suffering. One day, the temple's master, an ancient woman named Seiko, called Meiho to her quarters. Seiko was known for her silence, sometimes going months without speaking. When she did speak, her words were chosen with the precision of a master calligrapher's brush. Meiho entered, bowed, and knelt before her teacher, expecting perhaps another meditation instruction, another sutra to copy, another practice to perfect. Instead, Seiko asked a simple question: "Why are you here?" Meiho answered automatically, "To practice the Dharma." "Master, to seek enlightenment." "Lies," Seiko said, not unkindly. "You are here to punish yourself. You are here because you believe if you suffer enough, your daughter might somehow, somewhere, be less dead. You are here because you are trying to serve a sentence for a crime. But tell me, Meiho, who is the judge? Who determined your sentence? And when precisely will you have suffered enough?" The question struck Meiho like physical blows. Her carefully constructed edifice of penance crumbled. I don't know," she whispered. "Exactly," Seiko said. "You don't know because there is no answer. There is no amount of suffering that balances the scales. There is no judge but yourself, and you have decided on a life sentence. But the Dharma does not teach life sentences, it teaches liberation." Meiho's tears came then, years of them. An ocean held back, finally breaking through its dam. "But I killed her," she sobbed. "My carelessness, my moment of inattention. I killed my own child." Seiko let her cry, offering neither comfort nor contradiction. When the storm of grief finally subsided, the old master spoke again. "Do you think your daughter would want this for you? This half-life of endless penance? Do you think her spirit, wherever it resides, finds peace in your suffering?" I don't know what she would want." "Then let me tell you what I know," Seiko said. "Children want their mothers to live, to truly live, not to exist as ghosts haunting the halls of their own regrets. Your daughter lived 5 years in this world. She knew your love. She felt your warmth. In her last days, she was held by you. That is not nothing. That is everything." "But if I had just—" Seiko raised her hand, stopping the familiar litany. If. The past is full of ifs, but they are all illusions. There is only what was. You drew water, a log rolled, a fire started, a child died. These are facts, as unchangeable as the mountains. Everything else, every should have, every if only, every alternative scenario your mind constructs, is a story you tell yourself. And it is a story that keeps you from living the life your daughter can no longer live." Meiho felt something shift inside her, like a great stone beginning to move after years of stillness. "How do I stop?" she asked. "How do I stop punishing myself?" "You decide to," Seiko said simply. "Forgiveness is not earned, Meiho. It is not a prize given for sufficient suffering. It is a choice, a decision, an act of will. You decide that today you will stop shooting yourself with the second arrow." The concept of self-forgiveness is perhaps one of the most challenging aspects of Buddhist practice, because it requires us to do something that feels almost impossible, to extend to ourselves the same compassion we might easily offer to others. We are often our own harshest judges, holding ourselves to standards of perfection we would never expect from anyone else. We replay our mistakes endlessly, as if by sufficient repetition we might somehow wear away the reality of what occurred. But there is a teaching in Buddhism that might help us understand this differently. It is the teaching of impermanence, of anicca. Everything changes. The person who made that mistake, who spoke those words, who made that choice, that person no longer exists. Not because they died, but because every moment we are becoming someone slightly different. The cells in our body replace themselves. Our thoughts evolve. Our understanding deepens. The person we were yesterday is not the person we are today, except in the continuity of memory and identity we create. This is not to absolve us of responsibility. Our actions have consequences, and those consequences ripple outward in ways we cannot always predict or control. But it is to say that clinging to guilt about the actions of someone we no longer are is like holding a grudge against a stranger. We are holding ourselves hostage to a version of ourselves that exists only in the past. There was a man named Ryokan, a poet and Zen monk, who lived much of his life in a small hut on a mountain. Ryokan was known for his gentleness, his love of children, and his terrible handwriting. People would come from distant villages to ask him to write calligraphy for them, and he would oblige, though his characters were known to be among the worst in the region. He didn't care. He wrote with joy, and that joy somehow transferred itself to the paper, despite the technical flaws. One winter, Ryokan received word that his younger brother had fallen into heavy drinking and gambling. The brother had abandoned his family, accumulated enormous debts, and was bringing shame to their clan. The family begged Ryokan to intervene, to use his reputation as a wise monk to talk sense into his brother. Ryokan agreed, though it meant a difficult journey down the mountain in harsh weather. When Ryokan arrived at his brother's house, he found exactly what he expected: disorder, poverty, and a man drowning in his own poor choices. The brother expected a lecture, a scolding, perhaps even disownment. Instead, Ryokan asked if he might stay the night before beginning his journey back to the mountain. The brother agreed, ashamed but unable to refuse. They ate a meager dinner in silence. Ryokan asked no questions about the gambling, the drinking, the abandoned family. He simply sat, present and peaceful, as if visiting the most honored household in the land. When it came time to sleep, Ryokan prepared his bedding near the door. In the morning, as Ryokan prepared to leave, his brother finally broke. "You traveled all this way," he said. "Aren't you going to tell me how disappointed you are? Aren't you going to lecture me about my failures?" Ryokan smiled and began tying his sandals. "The snow is very deep," he said. "Be careful when you walk." "That's it?" his brother said, anger and relief mixing in his voice. "That's all you have to say to me?" Ryokan straightened, adjusting his robe. "What would you have me say? That you have made mistakes? You know this already. That you have caused suffering. This too you know. Should I add my voice to the chorus of judgment that already rings in your ears? Would that help you? Would that change anything?" His brother looked away, tears forming. "I have ruined everything," he whispered. "Yes," Ryokan agreed. "You have made a mess, a considerable mess. And now you have a choice. You can spend your energy defending the mess, or explaining the mess, or feeling guilty about the mess. Or you can begin cleaning it up, not because you will ever make it perfect again. What is broken, but because today is today. And you are still here, and your family is still here, and there is still time to choose differently." "But how can I forgive myself?" his brother asked. "How can I look at what I've done and not hate myself?" Ryokan picked up his traveling staff. "Hate is easy," he said. "Hate requires no courage. Do you know what requires courage? To look at your mistakes clearly, without flinching, and then to choose to love yourself anyway. Not because you are perfect, but because you are alive, because you are learning, because you are capable of change. To forgive yourself is not to say what you did was acceptable. It is to say you are not defined forever by your worst moments. He paused at the door, looking back at his brother. The snow is very deep, he repeated. Each step you take will be difficult. But here is what I know about snow. It covers everything equally. It does not distinguish between the worthy and unworthy ground. And when spring comes, the snow melts, and what was buried emerges into new light. This is the nature of time. This is the nature of change. The question is whether you will be there to see the spring, or whether you will remain frozen in the winter of your own judgment. After Ryokan left, his brother sat for a long time in the cold house. The monk's words circled in his mind like birds searching for a place to land. For years, he had been trapped in a cycle. Make a mistake, feel terrible, try to numb the feeling, make more mistakes, feel worse. The guilt had become its own addiction, a familiar pain more comfortable than the uncertainty of trying to change. But Ryokan had offered something different. Not absolution. His mistakes were still his mistakes, their consequences still real. But permission, perhaps, to stop using those mistakes as a reason to keep making more. In Buddhist psychology, there is recognition of what are called the 5 hindrances, obstacles that block our progress toward clarity and peace. One of these hindrances is vyapada, often translated as ill will or aversion. We typically think of this as directed outward, as anger or hatred toward others. But one of the most destructive forms of ill will is that which we direct toward ourselves. Self-hatred, self-judgment, self-condemnation. These are forms of aversion that keep us trapped in suffering just as surely as hatred of others does. The antidote to ill will in Buddhist teaching is metta, loving kindness, and this loving kindness must begin with ourselves. Not as an act of ego or self-indulgence, but as a simple recognition of our shared humanity, our shared vulnerability, our shared capacity for both mistake and growth. There is a meditation practice in the Buddhist tradition specifically designed to cultivate this self-compassion. It begins with phrases directed toward oneself. May I be happy. May I be healthy. May I be safe. May I live with ease. For many people, especially those carrying deep regret, these phrases are among the most difficult words they will ever speak. To wish ourselves well feels like betrayal, as if by accepting our own goodness, we somehow minimize the harm we've caused. But consider this, your regret serves no one, not those you have harmed, not those you love, not the world at large, and certainly not yourself. Your suffering does not undo past harm. It only adds more suffering to the world. This is a difficult truth, but it is truth nonetheless. There was a woman named Sachiko who came to a meditation center carrying the weight of a terrible secret. 20 years earlier, when she was young and desperate, she had given up a child for adoption. The circumstances were complicated. She was alone, without resources, caught between cultures, terrified. She told herself it was for the child's good, that the adoptive family could provide what she could not. But the moment she signed the papers, a part of her heart froze solid, and it stayed frozen for 2 decades. She never spoke of it. She built a new life, married, had other children, but the secret sat inside her like a stone, growing heavier with each passing year. Every birthday of the child she'd given away, Sachiko would become distant, unreachable, locked inside her private grief. Her family learned to expect these dark periods, these days when she seemed to disappear, even while remaining physically present. When she came to the meditation center, it was because everything else had failed. Therapy, medication, distraction, work, nothing touched the core of her pain. In her first interview with the teacher, a monk named Soyen, she finally spoke the truth she had been carrying. The words came out broken and halting, each one a knife she had to swallow and then cough up again. When she finished, she sat waiting for judgment. Instead, Soyen asked. What were you supposed to do? The question confused her. I don't understand. You were young, alone, without resources, in a country where you barely spoke the language. You had a child you could not care for. What were you supposed to do? I should have found a way, Sachiko said automatically. I should have tried harder. I should have. Should have with what? Soyen interrupted gently. With the money you didn't have, with the family support that wasn't there, with the language skills you hadn't yet developed, with the knowledge of resources you had no way to access. You say you should have, but you speak from the perspective of who you are now. Educated, established, fluent, knowing. But that person did not exist 20 years ago. The person who made that decision was different. She did the best she could with what she knew, with what she had, with who she was. Sachiko felt something crack open inside her. But I abandoned my child, she whispered. Yes, Soyen agreed. You did. And that action caused pain, for the child, for the adoptive family navigating that complexity for you. This is true. But tell me, if you could go back to that young woman, that terrified girl, what would you say to her? Sachiko closed her eyes. In her mind, she saw herself as she had been. So young, so scared, so alone. I would tell her I understand, she said softly. I would tell her she wasn't a bad person. I would tell her she was doing the best she could in an impossible situation. Yes, Soyen said. You would offer her compassion. You would see her clearly, in all her complexity and difficulty and impossible choices. You would not hate her. So why do you hate her now? Why do you punish her, day after day, year after year? She is still you. She is the you that was. And she is asking, even now, for you to finally understand. Sachiko began attending the meditation center regularly. She learned the practice of metta, starting with the traditional phrases. But she found she could not yet say, "May I be happy," to herself. The words stuck in her throat like stones. So Soyen adjusted the practice. Begin smaller, he suggested. Begin with, "May I be safe from my own judgment. That is enough for now." Even this was difficult. For weeks, Sachiko sat on her cushion, trying to generate even the smallest warmth toward herself and finding only the familiar cold. But she persisted because there was nothing else left to try. Slowly, imperceptibly, something began to shift. It was not dramatic. There was no moment of sudden enlightenment, but gradually, she found she could sit with herself without quite so much hatred. She could think about that young girl she had been without immediately drowning in guilt. One day, during a meditation retreat, Sachiko had what practitioners call an insight. She suddenly saw clearly that all these years she had been punishing herself as a way of protecting herself. If she hated herself enough, if she judged herself harshly enough, then maybe she could preempt the judgment she feared from others. Maybe she could control the narrative. Maybe she could earn, through sufficient suffering, the right to exist, despite her mistake. But it hadn't worked. The protection she thought she was building was actually a prison, and the sentence she was serving had no end date, because she was both the prisoner and the judge, locked together in a cell of her own making. In the Dhammapada, one of the oldest Buddhist texts, there is a verse that reads, "Whoever has done harmful actions but later covers them with good is as radiant as the moon freed from clouds." This teaching does not suggest that good deeds erase bad ones, as if karma were a simple accounting ledger. Rather, it acknowledges that transformation is possible, that we are not forever defined by our worst moments, and that the choice to act differently now has its own power and meaning. The Buddhist concept of karma is often misunderstood. In popular usage, karma has become almost synonymous with fate or cosmic punishment, a kind of spiritual ledger where good deeds earn rewards and bad deeds earn punishments. But the original meaning is much more straightforward. Karma simply means action, and more specifically, the law of cause and effect. Every action has consequences. What we do matters. This is not mystical or supernatural. It is simply true. But here is what is also true. Karma is not fixed. The consequences of our actions ripple outward, but they do not determine every moment of our future. We are not trapped by our past actions like insects in amber. Every moment presents a new choice, a new opportunity to act differently, to create new karma. This is the hope embedded in the teaching. You are not your mistakes. You are what you do next. There was a businessman named Hiroshi who built his company on compromises. Small ones at first. A corner cut here, a regulation overlooked there, a competitor sabotaged through whispered lies. Each choice seemed insignificant in isolation, merely pragmatic. But over years, the compromises accumulated. His company grew wealthy, and Hiroshi grew wealthy with it. But the foundation was poisoned. When the truth eventually emerged, as truth has a habit of doing, the consequences were severe. Criminal charges, bankruptcy, public disgrace. Hiroshi lost everything. His company, his reputation, his wife who could not weather the shame, his adult children who changed their names to escape association. He was convicted, served 3 years in prison, and emerged into a world that had forgotten him except as a cautionary tale. He was 62 years old. He had no money, no prospects, no family willing to speak to him. Most people in his position might have given up, might have decided their life was effectively over. But something happened to Hiroshi in prison. In the absence of distraction, in the forced stillness of confinement, he was left alone with himself for perhaps the first time in his life. And he found he did not like what he saw. A prison chaplain, a woman who practiced Buddhism, introduced him to meditation. Hiroshi was skeptical. Meditation seemed like something for hippies and monks, not for disgraced businessmen. But he had nothing but time, so he tried it. At first, sitting still was torture. His mind was a chaos of regret, resentment, self-pity, and rage. Every meditation session was a confrontation with the wreckage of his life. But gradually, very gradually, something shifted. The thoughts were still there, the regrets, the if-onlys, the should-haves, but they began to feel less solid, less absolutely true. They were thoughts, not facts. They were stories he was telling himself, not objective reality. This distinction changed everything. By the time Hiroshi was released, he had developed a regular meditation practice. He also had a plan, though it was modest almost to the point of absurdity. He would spend the rest of his life trying to repay what he had taken. Not financially, that was impossible. He had nothing, but in other ways. He began volunteering at a homeless shelter, then at a program that helped former prisoners reintegrate into society. He lived in a single room, worked odd jobs for basic expenses, and gave his time freely to those who needed it most. He did not do this to earn redemption. He understood, after much painful reflection, that redemption was not something one earned. Some of the people he had harmed would never forgive him, and that was their right. His former business partners, the employees who lost their jobs, the investors who lost their savings, he could not give them back what they had lost. He could not undo the harm he had caused, but he could choose, every day, to act differently. He could choose to be someone who helped rather than harmed. Not because it would erase the past, but because today was today, and it required something of him. One evening, about 5 years after his release, Hiroshi was at the shelter helping serve dinner when a young man approached him. The young man's face was vaguely familiar, though Hiroshi could not place it. The young man studied him for a long moment, then said, "You're Hiroshi Nakamura." It was not a question. Hiroshi nodded, bracing himself for whatever was coming. Recognition was rarely pleasant. "My father worked for your company," the young man said. "He was one of your engineers. When the company collapsed, He lost everything: his pension, his savings. He had a heart attack from the stress. He survived, but he was never the same. Hiroshi felt the familiar weight settle over him. "I am sorry," he said quietly. "I know those words are inadequate, but I am truly sorry for the harm I caused." The young man was silent for a moment. Then he said something unexpected. "I've been watching you. I come here once a week to volunteer, and I've seen you here every time. At first I thought maybe you were doing it for show, for publicity. But there's never any publicity. You're just here, helping." Hiroshi didn't know what to say. He had not been expecting this. "I don't forgive you," the young man continued. "I'm not sure I can. What you did to my father, to all those families, it was wrong. But I also see that you're trying to be different. And I think my father would say that matters. Not that it fixes anything, but that it matters." They stood together in the noise and bustle of the shelter, two men connected by the painful threads of the past. Finally, Hiroshi said, "For what it's worth, I would understand if you hate me. I have given you reason." "I did hate you," the young man said, "for years, but hate is exhausting. And watching you here, I realize that if you can change, if you can become someone different than who you were, then maybe there's hope for all of us. Maybe we're not trapped by our worst moments. Maybe transformation is real." One of the teachings that appears repeatedly across Buddhist traditions is the parable of the raft. The Buddha taught that his teachings were like a raft, useful for crossing the river, but not something to carry on your back once you've reached the other shore. This teaching is about non-attachment, about not clinging even to useful things once they have served their purpose. But we can extend this metaphor to regret. Our past mistakes, our regrets, our guilt, these too are like rafts. They may have served a purpose once. Perhaps they taught us something about our values, about the importance of our actions, about our capacity to cause harm. That lesson is valuable. It is worth learning. But once we have learned it, we do not need to carry the raft forever. We do not need to let our past mistakes become our identity, our prison, our perpetual punishment. Letting go of regret is not the same as forgetting. It is not the same as dismissing our responsibility or minimizing the harm we may have caused. It is simply recognizing that continuing to suffer does not help anyone, and that we have the right, indeed, the responsibility, to live fully in the present moment. There was a teacher named Shunryu Suzuki who founded the San Francisco Zen Center. He was known for his gentle teaching style and his profound understanding of the difficulties faced by Western students trying to practice Zen. One day, a student came to him in great distress. The student had been practicing for several years, but he could not shake the feeling that he was fundamentally flawed, that his past mistakes made him unworthy of enlightenment. "I have hurt so many people," the student confessed. "I have been selfish and cruel. How can someone like me possibly become enlightened?" Suzuki Roshi looked at his student with great kindness. "You think enlightenment is for good people?" he asked. The student nodded. "Isn't it? Isn't that the whole point, to become better?" "No," Suzuki Roshi said simply. "Enlightenment is not for good people. It is not a reward for moral perfection. It is simply waking up to reality as it is. And reality as it is includes you, with all your mistakes and regrets and imperfections. You do not have to become worthy of enlightenment. You already are worthy because you are alive, because you are here, because you are capable of suffering and therefore capable of the end of suffering." "But what about all the harm I've caused?" the student asked. "What about it?" Suzuki Roshi replied. "The harm is real. The consequences are real. This is true. But tell me, does your guilt heal anyone you have hurt? Does your self-hatred undo any mistake you have made? Or does it simply add more suffering to a world that already contains too much?" The student had no answer. Suzuki Roshi continued, "You are practicing guilt as if it were a spiritual discipline. But guilt is not practice. Guilt is ego in disguise, the ego that says you should be perfect, that you should be special, that you should be beyond making mistakes. But you are not beyond making mistakes. You are human. This is not a flaw. It is simply what you are. Then what should I do? The student asked. How do I make amends? Ah, Suzuki Roshi said. Now you ask a better question. Making amends is different from guilt. Guilt looks backward and says, I am bad. Making amends looks forward and asks, what can I do now? Do you see the difference? The student thought about this. So I should try to repair the harm I've caused? If possible, yes. Suzuki Roshi agreed. But understand that full repair may not be possible. Some things, once broken, remain broken. Some harm, once caused, cannot be completely undone. This is painful to accept, but it is true. So yes, repair what you can. Apologize when apology is appropriate. Make restitution where restitution is possible. But also understand that your primary responsibility now is to not cause more harm. To live with integrity. To practice kindness. To be present. This is how you honor both those you have harmed and yourself. But how do I forgive myself? The student asked, returning to his original anguish. Suzuki Roshi was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, You are asking the wrong question. The question is not how to forgive yourself. The question is, who is there to forgive? When you sit in meditation and observe your thoughts carefully, can you find a solid, permanent self? Or do you find only a flowing stream of thoughts, feelings, sensations, constantly changing? The person who made those mistakes, do they still exist? Or have they become someone else? Someone who has learned? Someone who has changed? He leaned forward, his eyes kind but intense. You are holding yourself to account for actions committed by someone who no longer exists. That young, foolish, hurtful person. Where are they? Can you find them in this present moment? Or is there only you, here, now, a person who has learned from pain and is trying to live differently? The student felt something loosen in his chest. So I should just let it go? Not let it go, Suzuki Roshi corrected. Let it be. The past is already gone. You do not need to let it go because it is not here. What is here is your memory of it, your story about it, your judgment of it. And yes, those things you can let go. Not by force, not by saying, I should not think about this. But by seeing them clearly, as thoughts, as stories, as constructions of your mind, and then choosing not to believe them completely. He gestured to the meditation hall around them. This is why we practice. Not to become perfect, not to become so pure that we never make mistakes, but to see clearly, to see thoughts as thoughts, to see stories as stories, to see the difference between what actually is and what we tell ourselves about what is. When you can do this, forgiveness is not something you achieve. It is simply what remains when you stop punishing yourself for being human. The concept of right action is one of the 8 aspects of the Noble Eightfold Path, the Buddha's prescription for ending suffering. Right action involves understanding that our actions have consequences and choosing to act in ways that reduce rather than increase suffering. But what does right action mean in the context of past mistakes? How do we act rightly regarding wrongs we have already committed? The answer lies in understanding that right action is always present tense. We cannot go back and act differently in the past. That opportunity is gone. But we can act rightly now. Right action. Regarding past mistakes means acknowledging them honestly, learning from them, making amends where possible, and then choosing to act with greater wisdom going forward. There is a story from the Thai forest tradition about a monk named Khao Suan Luang, who was known for his strict discipline and harsh self-judgment. As a young man, before ordaining, he had been a soldier. During a village raid, in the chaos and fear of combat, he had killed a young man, barely more than a boy. The image of that boy's face haunted him for decades. When he became a monk, Cao Xuan Luang took on the most austere practices. He lived in the forest, ate one meal a day, meditated for hours, and refused any comfort. Other monks admired his dedication, but his teacher, Ajahn Mahabua, saw something different. He saw a man using spiritual practice as self-punishment, trying to pay a debt that could never be paid. One day, Ajahn Mahabua called Cao Xuan Luang to him. "You have been a monk for 15 years, the teacher said. In that time, you have been more disciplined than almost anyone else in this monastery. Yet I see no peace in you. Why is that?" Cao Xuan Luang bowed his head. "I carry a great sin, teacher. I killed a man when I was young. How can I find peace with such a burden?" Ajahn Mahabua nodded slowly. "And do you think the boy you killed finds peace in your suffering?" The question was like a slap. Cao Xuan Luang looked up, confused. I don't understand. Do you think," Ajahn Mahabua continued, "that wherever that young man's consciousness has gone, whether reborn, whether dissolved, whether resting, do you think it is helped by your torment? Does your pain balance his pain? Does your guilt give him peace?" "No," Cao Xuan Luang admitted. "But what else can I do? The deed is done. I cannot undo it." "No," his teacher agreed. "You cannot undo it, but you can stop doing it over and over again in your mind. Every day you kill that boy again in your thoughts. Every day you replay the moment, you relive the horror, you re-inflict the wound. Not just on him, but on yourself. How many times must he die? How many times must you kill him?" Cao Xuan Luang felt tears on his face. "I don't know how to stop," he whispered. "Begin by understanding this," Ajahn Mahabua said. "That boy is dead. He died once, many years ago. He is not dying now. The suffering happening now is your suffering, not his. You have transformed his death into a tool for your own punishment. But this serves no one. It does not honor his life. It does not restore anything. It only creates more suffering where suffering already exists." "Then what should I do?" Cao Xuan Luang asked. "How do I live with what I have done?" "You live by living," his teacher replied. "You take the life that remains to you, the life that boy no longer has, and you use it well, not through harsh punishment of yourself, but through genuine practice, through developing compassion, through helping others, through becoming someone who protects life rather than takes it. The person you were when you killed that boy, that person was afraid, caught in circumstances of war, acting from confusion and fear. But that person is gone. The question is, who are you now? And who do you choose to become? But won't I forget him if I stop punishing myself? Cao Xuan Luang asked. Won't I dishonor his memory? There is a difference, Ajahn Mahabua said, between remembering and ruminating. Remembering is acknowledging what happened, learning from it, allowing it to inform how you live. Ruminating is replaying it endlessly, torturing yourself with it, using it as a barrier to living fully. You can remember the boy without destroying yourself. In fact, the best way to honor him is to take the lessons from his death, the precious nature of life, the terrible cost of violence, the importance of acting from clarity rather than fear, and let those lessons shape you into a better person. Cao Xuan Luang absorbed these words slowly. It was not a quick transformation. Decades of self-punishment do not dissolve overnight. But he began to shift his practice. Instead of using meditation as a form of self-flagellation, he began to use it as his teacher suggested, to develop genuine compassion, including compassion for himself. He began to allow that he was worthy of the life he still possessed, and that the best use of that life was not endless guilt, but genuine transformation. Years later, a young monk asked Cao Xuan Luang about the rumors he had heard, that the older monk had killed someone before ordaining. Was it true? Cao Xuan Luang did not deny it. Yes, he said simply. In another life, in another time, I was someone who took a life. This is true. And you can live with that? The young monk asked, somewhat shocked. I live with it by living, Cao Xuan Luang replied. The person who committed that act is gone. I cannot bring back the boy who died. I cannot undo what was done, but I must, use the life I have remaining to create more wisdom and less suffering in the world. This is not forgetting. This is not minimizing. This is simply recognizing that I have a choice about what I do with the days I have left. I can spend them in guilt, or I can spend them in service. The boy's death cannot be changed, but what I do in response to it can. In the Theravada Buddhist tradition, there is a practice called contemplation of death. This might seem morbid at first, but its purpose is not to cultivate fear or despair. Rather, it is to cultivate perspective, to remind us that our time is limited and therefore precious. When we truly understand that we will die, that our time here is finite, it becomes harder to justify wasting that time on endless self-recrimination. Imagine you were told you had 1 year to live. How would you spend that year? Would you spend it reliving your past mistakes, cycling through guilt, punishing yourself for things you cannot change? Or would you choose to live as fully as possible, to love as completely as possible, to make whatever contribution you could in the time remaining? Now consider this. You do not know how much time you have. It might be 1 year, it might be 50 years, but it is finite. Every day spent drowning in regret is a day you will never get back. This is not meant to pressure you into toxic positivity or forced happiness. It is simply an invitation to consider whether your suffering is serving any useful purpose, or whether it is simply habit, a familiar pain more comfortable than the vulnerability of trying to live differently. There was a woman named Jin Ai who lived in a small Korean town. When she was 43 years old, her teenage daughter was killed by a drunk driver. The driver was also young, barely 20, a university student who had made a terrible decision. He survived the crash with minor injuries. Jinai's daughter did not. The trial was agonizing. The young man, his name was Minjun, was convicted and sentenced to 5 years in prison. It seemed absurdly insufficient to Jinny. 5 years for her daughter's entire life. 5 years for all the futures that would never happen, all the moments that would never be lived. But the law was the law, and 5 years was what he received. Jinny's grief transmuted into rage, and her rage hardened into a bitter obsession. She attended every parole hearing to argue against his release. She started a website detailing his crime, ensuring anyone who searched his name would know what he had done. She built her life around keeping him accountable, around ensuring he could never forget, never move on, never be free of what he had done. And in doing so, she locked herself in prison alongside him. Her friends drifted away, unable to be around her constant anger. Her husband, also grieving, could not reach her through the walls she had built. She quit her job to focus on her crusade. Years passed, and she barely noticed them, because she was living in the frozen moment of her daughter's death, playing it over and over, unable to move forward. When Minjun was finally released after serving his full sentence, Jinai was there, along with several reporters she had contacted. She expected to feel satisfaction seeing him emerge, beaten down by years of incarceration. Instead, what she saw confused her. He was thin, yes, and obviously marked by his time in prison. But there was something else in his face, a kind of sorrow so deep it seemed to have carved new lines into his features. He saw her immediately, standing there with her signs and her reporters. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Jinai saw something she had not expected. She saw that he had not forgotten, had not moved on, had not minimized what he had done. She saw that he too had been living in that frozen moment, trapped in the worst night of his life, carrying the weight of her daughter's death every day. This realization did not bring forgiveness, not then, perhaps not ever, but it brought something else, recognition. She saw that she had been so focused on ensuring he suffered that she had not noticed she was suffering just as much. She had thought that by keeping him trapped in his guilt, she was honoring her daughter. But in reality, she had trapped herself, and her daughter, her beautiful, vibrant daughter who loved life, would not have wanted this for her mother. The reporters asked Jin'e for a statement. They expected more of her usual fierce condemnation. Instead, she found herself saying, "I'm tired." Just that. "I'm tired." She went home. For the first time in 5 years, she did not update her website. She did not plan her next action. She simply sat in her house, feeling the exhaustion of years of rage. Her husband found her there, sitting in the dark. He sat beside her without speaking, and they held hands in silence, two people who had lost their way in grief. It was not an ending. There was no sudden healing, no moment of reconciliation that made everything all right. Jin'e would grieve her daughter for the rest of her life, but slowly, imperceptibly, she began to make a different choice. She began to ask herself not, "How can I ensure he suffers?" but, "How do I want to live the years I have remaining?" She started attending a support group for parents who had lost children. She resisted at first. She did not want to be around other people's grief. She could barely handle her own. But the group leader was gentle and persistent, and eventually Jin'e found something unexpected. Community. Other people who understood. Other people who had also stood at the precipice of consuming rage and somehow stepped back. In one meeting, an older woman shared that her son had been killed 15 years earlier. She spoke about the years she had lost to grief and anger, and then about the slow process of deciding to live again, not because the pain went away, but because she realized her son would want her to live. Jin'e found herself crying, the first real tears she had shed in years, not tears of rage but of grief, pure and simple. After the meeting, she approached the older woman. "How did you do it?" she asked. "How did you decide to live again?" The woman smiled sadly. "I asked myself a question," she said. "I asked, if I could speak to my son one more time, what would he say to me? Would he want me to spend the rest of my life frozen in anger? Would he want me to destroy myself in pursuit of revenge? Or would he want me to remember him with love, to carry him forward by living as fully as I could?" "And what was your answer?" Jin'e asked. "I knew the answer immediately," the woman said. "He would want me to live. Not to forget him, never that, but to live in a way that honored his love of life, not his death. So, I decided to try. Not all at once, just one day at a time. Some days I failed, but I kept trying. And slowly, life became possible again." The Buddhist teaching of dependent origination, or pratityasamutpada, tells us that everything arises from causes and conditions. Nothing exists in isolation. Nothing is entirely self-caused. This teaching has profound implications for how we understand our own mistakes and regrets. The person who made that choice, who spoke those words, who committed that act, they did not spring into being fully formed. They were shaped by countless causes and conditions, their upbringing, their circumstances, their knowledge at the time, their emotional state, their fears and hopes and misunderstandings. This does not absolve us of responsibility. We are still responsible for our actions. But it does invite us to see our mistakes with more complexity, to understand that the causes of our actions extend far beyond our individual will. We are not isolated agents acting in a vacuum. We are interconnected beings, shaped by forces we only partially understand and control. When we can see this clearly, our relationship to regret shifts. We can acknowledge our part in causing harm, while also recognizing that we were not entirely in control, that we were acting from a limited understanding, that we were ourselves shaped by suffering and confusion. This is not an excuse. It is simply a more complete picture of reality. There was a therapist named Rachel who specialized in working with people carrying deep shame and regret. Many of her clients had committed serious harms. Some had been violent, some had been negligent. Some had made choices in addiction that destroyed families. They came to her because they could not live with themselves. because the weight of what they had done felt unbearable. Rachel had developed an exercise she used with many of these clients. She called it the chain of causes. She would ask them to describe their regret in detail, and then to work backwards through all the causes and conditions that led to that moment. What were they feeling just before? What had happened earlier that day? What was happening in their life at that time? What about their childhood prepared them for that moment? What about their parents' lives, their grandparents? At first, clients usually resisted this exercise. It felt like making excuses, like trying to dodge responsibility. But Rachel would gently persist. And slowly a picture would emerge, not of an evil person choosing evil, but of a complex human being shaped by suffering, making a choice from within a web of pain and confusion. One client, a man named Marcus, had driven drunk and caused an accident that left another driver paralyzed. He came to Rachel because he was actively suicidal, unable to see any way forward from what he had done. In their sessions, Rachel asked him to trace back the chain of causes. "I chose to drive," Marcus said. "That's what matters. I knew I was drunk, and I drove anyway." "Yes," Rachel agreed. "That is what matters. And you were drunk because I was at a bar, drinking, obviously. And you were at a bar because—" Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Because I had just been fired. I was angry and scared, and I wanted to, I don't know, drown it out." "And you had been fired because I'd been showing up late, messing up projects. I wasn't handling stress well. And you weren't handling stress well because—" Marcus started to see where this was going. "Because my father had just died, and I was a mess. I didn't know how to deal with it. He and I had a complicated relationship. There was a lot of unresolved stuff." They continued tracing backward, to Marcus's childhood, to his father's alcoholism, to his grandmother's untreated depression, to poverty and trauma, and patterns passed down through generations. By the end, they had a picture of someone who had made a terrible choice, yes, but who had made it from within a life shaped by forces beyond his control. "Does this mean I'm not responsible?" Marcus asked. And Rachel could hear both hope and fear in his voice. "No," Rachel said firmly. "You are still responsible. You made a choice that harmed someone terribly. That is real. But you are also not a monster. You are a human being who made a terrible decision from within a context of pain and confusion. Can you see the difference?" Marcus thought about this. "So what do I do with that understanding?" "You hold both truths at once," Rachel explained. "You acknowledge the harm you caused, fully, without minimizing it. And you also extend compassion to the person you were in that moment, not because what you did was okay, but because that person was suffering and confused and did not have the resources or clarity to make a better choice. From that place of holding both truths, you can ask, what do I do now? How do I live the rest of my life in a way that acknowledges the harm I caused while also recognizing my humanity? Over many months, Marcus began to develop what psychologists call self-compassion. This was different from self-esteem, which is often contingent on our successes and failures. Self-compassion was a baseline recognition of shared humanity, of the understanding that all people suffer, all people make mistakes, all people are worthy of basic compassion simply because they are sentient beings capable of suffering. This did not make his guilt disappear. He still carried the knowledge of what he had done, still felt genuine remorse for the life he had altered. But the guilt no longer consumed him entirely. He could acknowledge his mistake and also believe he was worthy of continuing to live, of trying to do better, of contributing positively to the world. Eventually, Marcus began volunteering for organizations working to prevent drunk driving. He spoke at schools, sharing his story, not to seek sympathy, but to help young people understand the real consequences of these choices. He wrote a letter to the man he had injured, not expecting forgiveness. The man had every right to hate him, but simply expressing his genuine remorse and his commitment to ensuring no one else suffered as that man had. The man never responded to his letter, which was his right. But Marcus's life began to have meaning again. Not the same meaning it had before, that life was gone, ended by his choice to drive drunk, but a new meaning, built on the foundation of acknowledging his mistakes, learning from them, and choosing to act differently going forward. One of the most powerful teachings in Buddhist philosophy is the concept of beginner's mind, or shoshin. This is the practice of approaching each moment with freshness, without the overlay of fixed ideas and expectations. In Zen, there is a saying, "In the beginner's mind there are many possibilities, but in the expert's mind there are few." What does this have to do with regret? Everything. When we carry regret, we fix ourselves in place. We tell ourselves a story. I am the person who did this terrible thing. This is who I am. That story becomes our identity, our prison. But beginner's mind invites us to approach each moment, including each moment of our own identity, with freshness. Yes, you did that thing. But are you still that person? Or are you, right now, in this present moment, someone who can choose differently? Every moment is an opportunity to begin again, not to erase the past, but to choose differently in the present. This is not naive optimism. It is the deepest realism. The past is past. It cannot be changed. The only thing that can be changed is what happens next. And what happens next is always, in some measure, up to us. There was a Zen master named Taisen Deshimaru who taught in France in the latter part of the 20th century. He was known for his fierce teaching style and his ability to cut through his students' self-deception. One day, a student came to him with a familiar complaint. She had been practicing for years, but she kept making the same mistakes. She would lose her temper, speak harshly, act selfishly. She was beginning to believe she was incapable of real change. Deshimaru listened to her catalogue of failures, then asked a simple question. "How long have you been making these mistakes?" "Years," the student said. "The same patterns, over and over. I feel like I'm trapped in them." "And in those years," Deshimaru continued, "have you ever, even once, acted differently?" The student thought about this. "Well, yes, sometimes. Sometimes I catch myself before losing my temper. Sometimes I choose kindness when my impulse is toward cruelty." "Ah," Deshimaru said. "So you are not actually trapped. You are capable of change. You have proven this. The question is not whether you can change, but how often you remember that you can." "But the fact that I keep falling back into the same patterns, doesn't that mean the change isn't real?" the student asked. Deshimaru shook his head. "It means you are human. It means you have habitual tendencies, patterns worn deep by repetition. But habits can be changed. Not overnight, not through a single moment of insight, but through patient, persistent practice. Every time you notice the habit and choose differently, you weaken that pattern. Every time you fall back into the habit, you have an opportunity to begin again. This is practice, not perfection, but persistence." He leaned forward, his gaze intense. "You are expecting yourself to be transformed completely and permanently, like a caterpillar becoming a butterfly. One change, irreversible. But human transformation is not like that. It is more like turning a great ship. You cannot turn it all at once. You adjust the rudder slightly, and the ship continues forward, but its direction begins to change. Degree by degree, so slowly you might not notice at first, the ship turns. Eventually you find you are heading in a completely different direction, but it required patience. It required consistent small adjustments, not one dramatic turn." The student absorbed this. "So I should just keep trying, even though I keep failing?" "You keep trying because you keep failing," Deshimaru said. "Success would mean practice is over. Failure means practice continues, and practice continuing means you are still alive, still learning, still capable of growth. Do you see? Your failures are not evidence that change is impossible. They are evidence that you are in the process of changing. This teaching reframes how we understand our relationship to our mistakes and habits. We often see repeated patterns as evidence that we cannot change, that we are fundamentally flawed. But from a Buddhist perspective, the very fact that we are aware of our patterns, that we keep trying despite repeated failures, is itself progress. The awareness is the first step. The intention to change is the second step. The actual behavioral change is the final step, but it requires the first two steps to happen first. And here is the radical truth. Even if you never fully change, even if you struggle with the same patterns for your entire life, the trying matters. The awareness matters. The intention matters. Not because they will earn you some cosmic reward, but because they represent your refusal to be defined entirely by your worst impulses. They represent your commitment to something beyond your immediate reaction, your immediate comfort, your immediate habit. There was another student of Deshimaru's, a man who had done significant harm to others through his actions during wartime. He had come to Zen practice carrying enormous guilt, and even after years of practice, the guilt remained. He approached Deshimaru in despair. "Master, I have practiced for 10 years. I meditate every day. I follow the precepts as best I can. But I still feel the weight of what I did. When does the guilt go away?" Deshimaru was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Perhaps it doesn't go away completely. Perhaps that weight is part of what keeps you practicing, keeps you trying to live differently. The question is not whether the guilt goes away, but whether you can carry it without being crushed by it, whether you can acknowledge what you did, feel genuine remorse, and still choose to live fully. Can you do that?" The student thought about this radical possibility, that perhaps full release from guilt was not the goal. Perhaps the goal was to live well even in the presence of guilt, to transform guilt from a paralyzing force into a motivating one. "I don't know if I can," he admitted. "Then find out," Deshimaru said. "That is your practice. Not to become someone who never did what you did, not to become someone so enlightened they feel no guilt, but to become someone who can acknowledge their past, feel appropriate remorse, and still choose to engage fully with the present moment. This is possible. I have seen it. The question is whether you are willing to try." In the Mahayana Buddhist tradition, there is a beautiful concept called the Bodhisattva vow. A bodhisattva is someone who vows to work toward the liberation of all beings, even if it takes infinite lifetimes. The vow itself is almost absurd in its ambition to save all beings from suffering. How could any individual accomplish such a thing? And yet practitioners take this vow, not because they believe they will succeed in any conventional sense, but because the vow itself transforms them. It orients their life towards something beyond their individual concerns, something that gives meaning to their actions. What does this have to do with regret? Everything. When we are trapped in regret, we are entirely focused on ourselves, our mistakes, our guilt, our suffering. This inward focus intensifies the suffering. But when we can shift our orientation outward, when we can ask, how can my experience, even my mistakes, be of service to others? Something shifts. Our pain gains meaning. Our mistakes become teachers, not just for ourselves, but for others who might learn from them. This does not erase the harm we may have caused, but it does offer a way forward, a way of transforming suffering into something that might, in some small way, reduce suffering for others. There was a teacher named Pema Chodron, a Western Buddhist nun in the Tibetan tradition, who often spoke about this transformation of pain into compassion. She had her own history of mistakes and failures, a difficult divorce, struggles with her children, times when she acted from hurt rather than wisdom. She did not hide these failures. In fact, she spoke about them openly, using them as teaching tools. In one talk, she described what she called the poison into medicine principle. In Tibetan Buddhism, there is a teaching that anything, even poison, can become medicine if we know how to use it properly. Our most painful experiences, our deepest regrets, our worst mistakes, these too can become medicine. Not medicine that makes everything okay, but medicine that helps us and others wake up to reality, develop compassion, understand the importance of our choices. A student once asked her, "But how do I do that? How do I transform my regret into something useful?" Pema suggested this practice. Whenever you feel regret arising, instead of spiraling into self-recrimination, pause. Acknowledge the regret. Feel it fully without trying to push it away. And then think, others feel this too. I am not alone in this experience of regret, of having made mistakes, of having caused harm. This pain I feel connects me to the vast web of human suffering. Then, from that place of connection, generate the intention. May my experience of this pain help me understand others who are suffering. May my mistakes teach me to be more compassionate toward others who make mistakes. May I transform this suffering into wisdom that helps not just me, but everyone I encounter. This practice does not erase the regret, but it shifts our relationship to it. The regret becomes not just a personal burden, but a bridge of compassion, a way of connecting to others, a teacher that helps us become more understanding and kind. There was a woman named Susan who had abandoned her young son when he was 5 years old. She had been in the grip of addiction at the time, unable to care for herself, let alone a child. Her parents had taken custody, and Susan had disappeared into her addiction for nearly a decade. By the time she got sober, her son was 14, and the damage was done. He wanted nothing to do with her, and she could not blame him. Susan carried this abandonment as her defining shame. She had destroyed the most important relationship in her life, failed in the most fundamental way a mother can fail. In early sobriety, this shame nearly destroyed her. She relapsed twice, each time because the pain of facing what she had done felt unbearable. But in her third attempt at recovery, Susan found a sponsor who practiced Buddhism. The sponsor introduced her to the practice Pema Chodron described, of transforming poison into medicine. At first, Susan resisted. Her crime felt too great to be redeemed, too terrible to be used for any positive purpose. But her sponsor was patient. "You abandoned your son," the sponsor said bluntly. "That is true, and you cannot undo it. Also true. So now you have a choice. You can let that abandonment define you and destroy you, or you can let it teach you, and through that teaching, perhaps help other mothers who are struggling, other addicts who are in the grip of something they can't control, other children who feel abandoned." Susan began attending support groups for parents in recovery. At first, she just listened, unable to speak. But gradually, she began to share her story. She did not minimize what she had done or make excuses. She simply told the truth. "I abandoned my child. I was not strong enough, not healthy enough, not whole enough to be the mother he needed, and I will carry that regret for the rest of my life. But I also know that I am not alone in this experience. Other parents here have done similar things, or fear they might, or are currently in the grip of addiction that is destroying their relationships with their children. So I share my story not to seek forgiveness, but to say, you are not alone, and it is possible to choose differently, even if you can't undo the past." Her story resonated. Other parents in the group began to open up about their own abandonments, their own failures, their own crushing guilt. Susan found that by being willing to speak her truth, she created space for others to speak theirs. This did not fix her relationship with her son. He was still, understandably, hurt and angry. But it gave her suffering meaning. It transformed her deepest shame into something that could, in small ways, help others. Years later, when Susan's son was in his 20s, he reached out to her for the first time since childhood. He had heard, through extended family, about her work with other parents in recovery. He was curious about this mother he barely remembered, this person who had both harmed him so deeply and apparently helped others avoid similar harm. They met for coffee. It was awkward, stilted, heavy with years of pain and absence. Susan did not ask for forgiveness. She simply said, "I am sorry. What I did to you was wrong. There is no excuse. If you want to have some form of relationship, I am open to that. If you don't, I understand completely. Either way, I want you to know. I carry what I did to you every day, and I have tried to transform that pain into something that might help others, because I cannot give you back your childhood, but I can try to prevent other children from experiencing what you experienced." Her son listened. He was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "I don't know if I can forgive you, but I respect what you've done with your life since getting sober, and maybe we could try to know each other. Not as mother and son, I don't know if we'll ever have that, but as two people trying to make sense of a difficult history. It was not a fairy tale ending, but it was something. A small crack in the wall of pain that had separated them, and it happened in part because Susan had been willing to transform her deepest regret into service, into connection, into medicine that might help others heal." The teaching of metta, or loving kindness, is central to many Buddhist traditions. The practice involves systematically cultivating feelings of goodwill toward ourselves and others. Traditionally, it begins with ourselves. May I be happy, may I be healthy, may I be safe, may I live with ease. Then it extends outward to loved ones, to neutral people, to difficult people, and finally to all beings everywhere. But for many people carrying deep regret, the first step, extending loving kindness to oneself, is the most challenging. It can feel impossible, even obscene, to wish ourselves well when we believe we have caused significant harm. We feel we do not deserve kindness, even from ourselves. We feel that to wish ourselves well is to minimize the harm we've caused, to let ourselves off the hook. But this is a misunderstanding of what metta practice is for. Metta is not a reward for good behavior. It is not contingent on our worthiness. It is a practice of recognizing the basic humanity in all beings, including ourselves. It is based on the understanding that all beings, without exception, want to be happy and free from suffering. This includes us, even when we've made terrible mistakes, even when we carry deep regret. We still, fundamentally, want to be happy and free from suffering. Denying ourselves kindness does not help those we have harmed. It does not undo any damage. It only adds more suffering to a world already full of suffering. And from a Buddhist perspective, this additional suffering serves no purpose. There was a meditation teacher named Tara Brach, who worked extensively with people carrying shame and self-hatred. She noticed a pattern. Many of her students could feel genuine compassion for others, for strangers, for people who had harmed them, even for people who had committed terrible acts. But they could not extend that same compassion to themselves. For themselves, there was only harsh judgment, only a sense of being fundamentally flawed and unworthy. Tara developed a practice she called RAIN: recognize, allow, investigate, nurture. When feelings of regret or self-judgment arise, the practice is to first recognize them. This is regret. This is self-judgment. Then allow them. Don't try to push them away. Don't try to fix them. Just let them be present. Then investigate them. Where do you feel this in your body? What beliefs underlie these feelings? What are you afraid might happen if you let go of this self-judgment? And finally, nurture. Offer yourself the same kindness you would offer a dear friend who was suffering. One of Tara's students, a man named David, had spent years unable to forgive himself for his failures as a father. He had been absent during his children's early years, consumed by work and his own ambitions. By the time he realized what he had missed, his children were grown and distant. The relationship damage was profound. David's regret was all-consuming. He would lie awake at night, replaying moments he had missed, imagining the father he should have been. Tara taught him the RAIN practice. When regret arose, David learned to recognize it. This is regret. This is the familiar pain. Then allow it. Rather than trying to distract himself or push it away, he would simply acknowledge its presence. Then investigate. He began to notice that the regret lived in his chest as a physical tightness. That underneath it was a belief that he was fundamentally defective, that his greatest fear was that his children would never forgive him and he would die alone. But the final step, nurture, was where David struggled. Tara suggested he imagine his regret as a small child, scared and hurting. Could he offer that child kindness? Could he say to that part of himself, "I see you. I see how much you're hurting. I'm sorry you're in such pain." At first, David could not. The very thought felt like betrayal, like he would be comforting the person who had caused the harm. But Tara gently pointed out, he was not two separate people. The David who had been absent from his children's lives and the David who now felt such regret were the same person. By withholding compassion from himself, he was only ensuring his own continued suffering. And that suffering did not help his children. It did not undo his absence. It only guaranteed he would remain stuck in the past, unable to be fully present now. Slowly, painfully, David began to practice self-compassion. It felt awkward and false at first, but he persisted, because he had tried everything else and nothing had worked. He began to notice that on days when he was gentler with himself, he was actually more able to reach out to his children, to be present in their lives now. The self-punishment had been creating a barrier. He felt so bad about himself that he could barely function, let alone build new relationships with his adult children. As his self-compassion grew, something unexpected happened. His children began to respond differently to him. They had always felt his self-hatred, his desperate need for their forgiveness, and it had pushed them away. But as David became more at peace with himself, as he stopped needing their forgiveness to feel okay, they became more open to connection. It was as if his self-acceptance gave them permission to accept him too. This is a paradox of forgiveness. When we stop desperately needing it, we often become more likely to receive it. When we can be okay even without external absolution, others sense that we've done the internal work and they feel safer engaging with us. There is a sutra in the Mahayana tradition called the Sutra of the Wise and the Foolish that contains a story about a man who commits a terrible crime. He kills his own mother in a moment of rage. Immediately after, he is overcome with remorse so profound that he becomes catatonic with guilt. He cannot eat, cannot sleep, cannot function. He is certain he is destined for the lowest hell realms. But when he encounters the Buddha, instead of condemning him, the Buddha tells him something surprising. The fact that you feel remorse, that you understand the gravity of what you've done, is itself the beginning of purification. The person who commits harm and feels no remorse, that person is in danger. But you, who are crushed by the weight of your action, who understand deeply what you have done, you have already begun to transform. The Buddha did not say the man's crime was okay. He did not minimize the harm, but he distinguished between the act and the person, between the mistake and the possibility of transformation. This distinction is crucial. We are not our worst actions. We are beings capable of both great harm and great good, and our past does not entirely determine our future. The teaching continues. The Buddha gives the man practices for purification, confession, making amends where possible, cultivating virtue, meditation. But the foundation of all these practices is the recognition that transformation is possible, that we are not forever defined by our worst moments. In contemporary psychology, there is research that supports this ancient Buddhist insight. Studies show that people who are able to separate their identity from their actions, who can say, "I did something bad," rather than "I am bad," are more likely to change their behavior. The guilt that says, "I did something wrong," can be motivating, can inspire us to make amends and act differently. But the shame that says, "I am wrong," is paralyzing. leading to more destructive behavior or to giving up entirely. This is why the Buddhist emphasis on seeing clearly is so important. See clearly what you did. Acknowledge it fully. Do not minimize or excuse it, but also see clearly that you are not identical with that action, that you are a complex being with the capacity for change, and that this present moment offers the opportunity to choose differently. There was a prison chaplain, a Buddhist priest named Kusala, who worked in a maximum security facility. Many of the men he worked with had committed serious violent crimes. They were serving long sentences, sometimes life without parole. For many of them, the weight of their actions was crushing. They saw themselves as monsters, as fundamentally different from good people, as beyond redemption. Kusala's approach was not to deny what they had done, but to help them see a more complete picture of who they were. In meditation sessions, he would guide them in practices of self-inquiry. Who were you before you committed this act? What conditions led to that moment? Who are you now years later? Who do you want to become? One prisoner, a man serving life for murder, spoke about this process. I had defined myself entirely by the worst thing I'd ever done. I was a murderer. That was my identity. Everything else about me was irrelevant. Chaplain Kusala didn't let me get away with that. He kept asking, "What else are you?" And at first, I had no answer. But he was persistent. "Are you a son, a brother, a man who likes music, a person who is learning to meditate, a human being who is capable of change?" Slowly, I began to see that I was all of these things. Yes, I was someone who had committed murder. That was true. That would always be true. But I was also other things. And those other things mattered. Not because they erased what I'd done, but because they represented the possibility of living differently, even in prison, even with no possibility of release. The prisoner continued. Chaplain Kusala taught us that our past determines what is possible, but it doesn't determine what we choose within those possibilities. I can't change the fact that I killed someone. I can't undo that harm, but I can choose how I live today, how I treat other prisoners, whether I use my time to become more bitter and violent or to develop some wisdom and compassion. Those choices are still available to me. This is the radical hope embedded in Buddhist teaching, that change is always possible, that no one is beyond transformation, that this present moment always offers the opportunity to choose differently, not to erase the past, but to move forward from it. Kusala would tell his students, "You cannot change what you did, but you can change who you are becoming." The person who committed that act is not the person you have to be for the rest of your life. You can become someone who understands deeply the cost of violence. Someone who values life precisely because you understand how fragile it is. Someone who has transformed their own violence into a commitment to non-harming. This transformation does not erase your crime, but it is still real, still valuable, still worth pursuing. The Zen tradition has a practice called koan study, in which students contemplate paradoxical questions or statements that cannot be resolved through logical thinking. One of the most famous koans is, "What was your original face before your parents were born?" This question points to something fundamental. Beneath all the layers of conditioning, beneath all the stories we tell about ourselves, beneath even our mistakes and regrets, there is some essential nature that remains untouched. This teaching does not mean that our actions don't matter, or that we can simply spiritually bypass our mistakes by claiming some pure Buddha nature underneath. But it does suggest that at the deepest level, we are not reducible to our history. There is something in us that predates our mistakes and will survive them, some capacity for awareness, for presence, for choice. When we sit in meditation and observe our thoughts about our regrets, we can notice something interesting. The thoughts come and go, but the awareness observing them remains. The regret arises, stays for a while, and then fades. But the one who is aware of the regret, that awareness is constant. This awareness is not touched by the content of our thoughts. It simply is. This teaching can be profoundly liberating for people trapped in regret. It suggests that even our deepest mistakes do not define the entirety of who we are. There is something in us that is larger than our history, something that remains fundamentally okay, even when our actions have not been. There was a Zen student named Michael who had caused a fatal car accident when he was 17. He had been texting while driving, a moment of teenage thoughtlessness that ended a young girl's life. The legal consequences were relatively minor. He was tried as a juvenile, served minimal time, but the psychological consequences were devastating. Michael became convinced that his life was essentially over, that he had no right to happiness, that he should spend the rest of his existence in penance. For years, he barely lived. He went through the motions of education and work, but he was not present. He was locked in that moment of the accident, replaying it endlessly, living in a kind of suspended animation. When he finally came to a Zen center in his late 20s, it was as a last resort. He was considering suicide, and some small part of him thought he should try one more thing before giving up entirely. His teacher, a woman named Roshi Enkyo, gave him a koan. "Show me your original face before the accident." Michael was confused. What did that even mean? He tried various answers, various interpretations, but none satisfied his teacher. She kept asking, "Before the accident, before the guilt, before the regret, what is there?" Michael struggled with this question for months. Every time he sat in meditation, he tried to find some part of himself that existed before the accident, but all he could find was the accident and its aftermath. His entire identity was built on that moment. He could not see past it. One day during meditation, something shifted. The familiar thoughts of guilt and regret arose, but instead of identifying with them, Michael found himself simply observing them. He noticed thought of accident, feeling of guilt, memory of the girl's face. They were thoughts and feelings, but they were not him. They arose in his awareness, but the awareness itself was unchanged by them. It was a small opening, but it was profound. For the first time in over a decade, Michael had a direct experience of something in him that was not defined by his mistake. It wasn't that the mistake didn't matter, or that he stopped feeling genuine remorse, but he saw clearly that his awareness, his basic capacity to be present, to experience, to choose, existed independent of that historical moment. He brought this insight to Roshi Enkyo. She smiled. "And what is this awareness?" she asked. It's just here," Michael said, struggling to put words to the experience. "It doesn't have a story. It's not good or bad. It just is." "Yes," Roshi Enkyo said, "and that just is. That is your original face. It was there before the accident. It is there now. It will be there in your last moment. It is not touched by your mistakes, even though your mistakes are real, and their consequences are real. Both things are true. You cause tremendous harm, and you are not reducible to that harm. Can you hold both truths?" This became Michael's practice, to acknowledge fully the reality of what he had done and its consequences, while also recognizing that he was not entirely defined by that moment. It was not either or. Either his mistake defined everything, or it meant nothing. It was both and. His mistake was real and significant, and he was also larger than that mistake. From this place, Michael began to live again. Not in denial of what he had done, but in acknowledgement that his life was still happening, that the present moment still existed, that he still had choices to make about how to live. He reached out to the girl's family, not expecting anything, but wanting to express his genuine remorse. The family was not ready to hear from him, and he accepted that. He began volunteering for organizations working on distracted driving prevention. He trained as a meditation teacher himself, working particularly with young people who had made serious mistakes. His life gained purpose again, not despite his mistake, but incorporating it. The accident became part of his story, but not the only part, not the final word. He was someone who had caused terrible harm and who had spent the following decades trying to live in a way that honored the girl's lost life by preventing similar losses. Both things were true: the harm and the healing, the mistake and the transformation. In the Thai forest tradition, there is a teaching about the Four Noble Truths that is particularly relevant to understanding regret. The first noble truth is often translated as life is suffering, but a more accurate translation is there is suffering, or suffering exists. The difference is important. The teaching is not that everything is suffering, but that suffering is a part of life, an inevitable aspect of existence. The second noble truth identifies the cause of suffering, tanha, usually translated as craving or attachment. We suffer because we want things to be different than they are. We crave pleasant experiences to continue and unpleasant experiences to end. We attach to our ideas about how things should be and suffer when reality doesn't conform. Regret is a perfect example of this dynamic. We want the past to be different than it was. We crave a history we don't have. We are attached to a version of events that never occurred. And because the past cannot be changed, this craving creates endless suffering. The third noble truth offers hope. There is an end to suffering. It is possible to be free from this kind of psychological pain. And the fourth noble truth describes the path to that freedom. The Noble Eightfold Path, which includes right understanding, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. For someone trapped in regret, this path begins with right understanding, seeing clearly that the past cannot be changed, that continuing to wish it were different is the source of present suffering. Then right intention, forming the intention to live skillfully in the present, rather than remaining trapped in the past. The other aspects of the path follow from there. But notice what the teaching does not say. It does not say, don't feel regret. It does not say, pretend the past didn't happen. It does not say, minimize your mistakes. It says, see clearly what is true, understand the mechanism of suffering, and choose to engage differently with your experience. There was a woman named Aya Kema, a German-born Buddhist nun who taught extensively in the West. She had lived through the Holocaust, escaping Germany as a teenager. Later in life, she carried enormous regret about not doing more to help others escape, about leaving family members behind, about surviving when so many did not. This survivor's guilt haunted her for decades. When she began practicing Buddhism, she brought this guilt to her meditation. At first, she tried to use meditation to get rid of the guilt, to make it go away. But it didn't work that way. The more she tried to push the guilt away, the more it persisted. Finally, her teacher gave her different instructions. Don't try to get rid of the guilt, just watch it, see it clearly. Notice when it arises, what triggers it, how it feels in your body, what thoughts accompany it. Just observe, without judging yourself for having these feelings. This practice of clear seeing changed Aya Kema's relationship to her guilt. She began to notice patterns. The guilt was triggered by certain memories, certain times of year, certain world events that reminded her of that period. The guilt felt like a heaviness in her chest, like a weight on her shoulders. The thoughts that came with it were variations on the same theme. You should have done more. You should have stayed. You don't deserve to be happy when they're dead. As she observed these patterns with clarity and without judgment, something remarkable happened. The guilt didn't go away, but it lost some of its power. She could see it as a conditioned response, as a pattern of thought and feeling that arose from causes and conditions, rather than as an absolute truth about her worthiness as a person. She began to ask deeper questions. What function does this guilt serve? What am I afraid would happen if I let it go? She realized that part of her held onto the guilt as a way of maintaining connection with those who died. If she let go of the guilt, She feared she would forget them, dishonor their memory. But was this true? Could she remember them, honor them, acknowledge the tragedy without torturing herself with endless what-ifs? She developed a practice. When guilt arose, she would acknowledge it. Guilt is present, and then consciously shift to remembrance and honoring. She would call to mind specific people who had died, would remember their faces, their kindness, what they meant to her. She would feel her grief for them. But then, instead of spiraling into self-recrimination, she would dedicate her meditation practice to their memory. May the merit of this practice honor those who did not survive. May their memory be a blessing. May I live in a way that honors their lost potential by fully living my own life. This practice did not erase her regret, but it transformed it. The regret became less about self-punishment and more about honoring memory. It became a motivating force for living fully rather than a reason to withhold life from herself. She understood that her survival was not something to feel guilty about, but something to use well, to help others, to teach, to be a voice for those who had been silenced. Years later, when Ayakima became a teacher herself, she was uniquely able to work with students carrying heavy regret, because she understood from the inside how guilt could be both real and unnecessary, how the past could matter enormously without dictating the present, how we could honor those we've harmed or lost without destroying ourselves in the process. There is a practice in Tibetan Buddhism called Tonglen, which translates as sending and receiving, or taking and sending. It is a meditation practice that seems, on the surface, counterintuitive. The practice involves breathing in suffering, your own or others, and breathing out relief, compassion, healing. Instead of trying to avoid pain, you deliberately invite it in, and instead of clinging to comfort, you give it away. This practice is particularly powerful for working with regret and guilt. Instead of trying to push away the painful feelings, instead of distracting ourselves or attempting to spiritually bypass them, we turn toward them directly. We breathe in the reality of our mistakes, the heaviness of our guilt, the pain of our regret, and then we breathe out compassion for ourselves, forgiveness, the possibility of healing. The practice is often extended outward. We breathe in not just our own regret, but the regret of all beings everywhere who have made mistakes and carry guilt. We recognize that we are not alone in this experience, that countless beings throughout time have struggled with the same painful awareness of having caused harm, and we breathe out compassion for all of us, wishing that all beings who carry regret might find peace, might forgive themselves, might be free from this particular suffering. This practice transforms regret from an isolating experience into a connecting one. Our pain becomes a bridge of understanding and compassion rather than a prison of self-judgment. There was a meditation teacher named Roshi Joan Halifax who worked extensively with dying patients and with prisoners. She often taught Tonglen practice in both contexts, as it offered a way to work skillfully with intense, difficult emotions, the fear and regret that often arise when facing death, or the guilt and shame that many prisoners carry. One prisoner she worked with, a man named James who was serving a long sentence for violent crimes, initially resisted the practice. "Why would I breathe in more pain?" he asked. "I'm already drowning in it," Joan explained. "You're already carrying the pain. It's not as if ignoring it makes it go away. It's there whether you acknowledge it or not. But by turning toward it consciously, by breathing it in deliberately, you change your relationship to it. Instead of being victimized by your pain, you become someone who can hold pain, who can transform it. You become larger than your suffering." James tried the practice. At first, it was overwhelming. Breathing in his regret, his guilt, his shame, it felt like drowning. But Joan encouraged him to stay with it, to keep breathing, to remember to breathe out compassion. Breathe in the reality of what you did and how it feels. Then breathe out forgiveness, healing, the possibility that you are not defined forever by your worst moment. Over weeks and months of practice, James noticed something shifting. The pain was still there, but he was no longer trying to run from it, no longer exhausting himself in constant efforts to avoid or numb it. He could simply acknowledge it. Yes, this is pain. Yes, this is guilt. It is here. And in that acknowledgement, without the added layer of resistance and avoidance, the pain was somehow more bearable. Joan then taught him to extend the practice outward. Breathe in not just your own pain, but the pain of everyone who has ever committed harm and then regretted it. All the other prisoners here, all the people throughout history who have acted from confusion and fear and hurt others, all those who carry the burden of their mistakes. This extension was profoundly healing for James. For years, he had felt uniquely terrible, as if his crimes set him apart from humanity, made him a monster distinct from normal people. But breathing in the collective regret of all beings who had ever caused harm, he recognized his fundamental sameness with others. He was not a monster. He was a human being who had acted monstrously. There was a difference. And then breathing out, may all beings who have caused harm find peace. May all who carry regret be free from its crushing weight. May all of us who have made terrible mistakes find the courage to live differently going forward. In wishing this for all beings, James found he could wish it for himself as well. His own healing became part of a larger collective healing. This is one of the profound insights of Mahayana Buddhism, that our individual liberation and collective liberation are inseparable. We cannot fully heal alone. Our healing is bound up with the healing of all beings. And paradoxically, when we stop focusing exclusively on our own suffering and expand our awareness to include the suffering of others, our own burden becomes lighter. James began sharing this practice with other prisoners. In the prison meditation group, men would sit together, breathing in their collective pain, the violence they had committed, the lives they had damaged, the families they had destroyed, the years lost to incarceration, and breathing out together. May we find peace. May we transform our understanding. May we use what remains of our lives to create less suffering. One evening, after meditation, one of the other prisoners said, "You know what's strange? Breathing in all that pain, I thought it would make me feel worse, but I actually feel lighter, like I'm not carrying it alone anymore." "That's exactly it," James replied. When it's just your pain, it's isolating, crushing. But when you recognize it's the human condition that all of us struggle with this, it becomes something you can work with. It's still pain, but it's pain that connects rather than separates. The Buddha taught extensively about skillful and unskillful actions. Unskillful actions are those that arise from greed, hatred, and delusion, and that create suffering for ourselves and others. Skillful actions are those that arise from generosity, loving kindness, and wisdom, and that reduce suffering. But here is what is crucial. The Buddha was always more interested in what we do next than in what we did before. Yes, acknowledge your unskillful actions. Yes, learn from them. But don't remain fixated on them. The important question is always, what is the skillful action available right now? This teaching is radically practical. It does not get lost in abstract philosophizing about worthiness or deservingness. It simply asks, given where you are right now, given what you know, given the circumstances you face, what is the action that will create the most benefit and the least harm? When we're trapped in regret, we're not asking this question. We're stuck in the past, replaying what we did wrong. But the past is gone. The only moment where we can act skillfully is this moment, right now. Regret that does not lead to changed behavior is just suffering for suffering's sake. There was a businessman named Tom who had built his company through ruthless practices. He had exploited workers, deceived customers, destroyed smaller competitors, and generally operated with the philosophy that profit justified any means. By the time he was 50, he was wealthy, but deeply unhappy. His children barely spoke to him. His marriage was loveless. He had no real friends, only business associates who tolerated him for their own advantage. A health scare, a minor heart attack, became the wake-up call. Lying in the hospital bed, Tom had a moment of clarity. He had spent his life accumulating wealth and power, and it had left him empty. Worse, he had hurt many people along the way. As he recovered, the regrets started flooding in. Names and faces of people he had harmed, families whose livelihoods he had destroyed, workers he had exploited. The weight of it was crushing. Tom's doctor recommended he try meditation for stress management. Tom was skeptical but desperate, so he found a local Buddhist meditation center. The teacher there, a monk named Bhante Sujato, listened to Tom's story without judgment. When Tom finished, after confessing his ruthless business practices and his crushing regret, he expected condemnation or perhaps some assignment of spiritual penance. Instead, Bhante Sujato asked a simple question: "What will you do now?" Tom was taken aback. "What do you mean? I need to atone somehow, don't I? I need to make up for what I've done." "Perhaps," Bhante Sujato said, "but atonement is not really a Buddhist concept. We don't believe in paying debts to some cosmic judge. We believe in cause and effect. You created certain causes through your actions. Those causes have had effects: harm to others, emptiness in yourself. Now you have the opportunity to create different causes. What causes do you want to create?" I want to fix things," Tom said. "But how do I fix decades of harm?" "You probably can't," Bhante Sujato said bluntly. "Not completely. Some harm, once done, cannot be fully repaired. This is a painful truth. But you can stop creating more harm, and you can begin creating benefit. These are available to you right now." Tom began the difficult process of figuring out what creating benefit looked like in his situation. He sold his company and used a significant portion of the proceeds to create a fund for the workers and small businesses he had harmed over the years. It didn't fully compensate them, but it was something. He reached out to his children and apologized sincerely, without expecting immediate reconciliation. He began volunteering his business expertise to help small ethical businesses succeed. Most importantly, he changed how he conducted himself day to day. Instead of seeing every interaction as a zero-sum competition, he began asking, "How can I be helpful here? How can I create benefit rather than extract advantage?" It was awkward at first. Decades of ruthless behavior don't reverse overnight. But he kept practicing. One day, about 2 years into this process, Tom was at the meditation center and ran into someone from his former business life, a man whose company Tom had destroyed years earlier. Tom immediately felt the familiar wave of shame and regret. He considered leaving, avoiding the confrontation, but instead he approached the man. "I owe you an apology," Tom said. "What I did to your company was wrong. I destroyed your livelihood for my own profit, and I am genuinely sorry." The man looked at him with a mixture of surprise and old anger. "Why are you telling me this now?" "What do you want?" "Nothing," Tom said. "I don't want anything. I just wanted you to know that I know what I did was wrong, and I'm sorry. I've set up a compensation fund. You're eligible. But even if you want nothing to do with that, I still wanted to apologize." The man was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "You really hurt me, you know. It took me years to rebuild. My family suffered." "I know," Tom said. "Or rather, I'm beginning to understand. I can't undo it. But I want you to know it wasn't okay, and I take responsibility for the harm I caused." The man nodded slowly. "I don't know if I forgive you, but I appreciate you saying that." He paused, then asked, "Are you really different now, or is this just another angle?" "I'm trying to be different," Tom said honestly. "I don't know if I'll succeed completely, but I'm trying. Every day, I'm trying to choose differently than I did before." This became Tom's practice, not to be crushed by the weight of his past, but to use it as information, as motivation to act differently in the present. The regret was there, but it was not paralyzing. It was energizing, a constant reminder to ask, in each moment, what is the skillful action available right now? One of the most beautiful teachings in Buddhism is the concept of mudita, which translates as sympathetic joy or appreciative joy. It is the practice of rejoicing in the happiness and success of others, the opposite of envy or jealousy. But mudita can also be turned inward. We can practice appreciative joy for our own positive qualities, our own growth, our own moments of acting skillfully. For people carrying deep regret, this inward mudita can be particularly healing. We become so focused on our mistakes that we lose sight of our positive qualities, our growth, our moments of wisdom and kindness. The practice of mudita invites us to acknowledge these positive aspects without minimizing our mistakes. This is not about false positivity or spiritual bypassing. It's about seeing the full picture. Yes, you made mistakes. And also, you have acted kindly. You have learned. You have grown. Both things are true. The practice is to acknowledge both with equal honesty. There was a woman named Maria who had been emotionally abusive to her daughter during the daughter's teenage years. Maria had been dealing with untreated depression and anxiety, and she had taken it out on her daughter. Constant criticism, impossible standards, emotional manipulation. By the time her daughter left for college, their relationship was severely damaged. Maria began therapy and was diagnosed and treated for her mental health issues. As she got healthier, she began to see clearly how much she had harmed her daughter. The regret was overwhelming. Every day, Maria was confronted with memories of cruel things she had said, unfair demands she had made, emotional wounds she had inflicted. Her therapist suggested she begin noticing not just her past mistakes, but also her current growth. Make a daily list, the therapist suggested. Write down 3 things you did today that reflect who you're becoming, rather than who you were. At first, Maria resisted. But I was so terrible to her. How can I celebrate myself when I did such damage? I'm not asking you to celebrate, the therapist clarified. I'm asking you to notice. There's a difference. Can you notice that you're making different choices now? That you're responding to stress differently? That you're learning and growing? Noticing that doesn't erase what you did. But refusing to notice it doesn't help your daughter either. In fact, the healthier and more whole you become, the more able you'll be to eventually rebuild your relationship with her. Maria started keeping the list. At first, the items seemed trivial. I felt frustrated today, but didn't lash out. I noticed myself falling into an old pattern and consciously chose differently. I apologized to my husband when I was short with him. But over time, the practice of noticing her growth began to shift something in her. She could still acknowledge her past behavior. It was still real, still harmful, but she could also see that she was genuinely changing. After about a year of this work, Maria reached out to her daughter with a carefully worded letter. She didn't ask for forgiveness or try to explain away her behavior. She simply acknowledged specifically what she had done wrong, expressed genuine remorse, described the work she had been doing on herself, and said she hoped someday they might be able to have a relationship. But she understood if her daughter wasn't ready. Her daughter didn't respond immediately. It was several months before Maria received a tentative email. I appreciate your letter. I'm not ready to see you yet, but I'm glad you're getting help. Maybe someday. It wasn't much, but it was something. And it had only been possible because Maria had done the work of simultaneously acknowledging her failures and recognizing her growth. If she had remained entirely focused on her guilt, she would have been too paralyzed to reach out. If she had minimized her actions, her daughter would have sensed it and closed the door permanently. But by holding both truths, I caused real harm and I am genuinely changing, she created the possibility of eventual healing. This is the practice of mudita applied to ourselves. Can we appreciate our growth even while acknowledging our mistakes? Can we notice our moments of wisdom even while holding our moments of foolishness? Can we celebrate our current choices even while feeling regret for our past ones? The Buddha taught that all beings have Buddha nature, that within everyone, there is the potential for complete awakening, for freedom from suffering, for the development of infinite compassion and wisdom. This Buddha nature is not earned through good behavior or lost through bad behavior. It is simply there, inherent, like the sky that remains even when covered by clouds. Our mistakes are like those clouds. They are real. They create shadows. But they do not fundamentally alter the sky. The practice is to see both: the clouds of our mistakes and the sky of our inherent worthiness and potential. Both are true. Both deserve acknowledgement. Maria continued her practice of noticing her growth while also holding her regret. Some days the regret was overwhelming, and on those days she could barely see any positive qualities in herself. Other days she felt more balanced, able to acknowledge both her past harm and her present growth. She learned to be patient with herself on the difficult days, trusting that the balance would return. Years later, when she and her daughter had slowly, carefully rebuilt a relationship, not the same as it might have been, but real and meaningful nonetheless, her daughter said something that stayed with Maria. "I could forgive you eventually, because I could see you had forgiven yourself. Not in a way that dismissed what you did, but in a way that allowed you to become someone different. If you had stayed trapped in guilt, I don't think we could have reconnected, because you would have needed my forgiveness too desperately, but you had done your own work. That made space for me to do mine." This is the paradox. Sometimes self-forgiveness is the most generous thing we can offer to those we have harmed, because it frees them from the burden of carrying our guilt for us. In Zen, there is a famous teaching story about a monk who asks his master, "What is Buddha?" The master replies, 3 pounds of flax." This nonsensical answer is typical of Zen. It defies logical interpretation, points beyond concepts, invites the student into direct experience rather than intellectual understanding. But there is a teaching hidden in this approach that is relevant to regret. We spend so much time thinking about our regrets, analyzing them, trying to understand them, constructing elaborate narratives about them. But all of this thinking is, in some sense, avoiding the direct experience of the present moment. What if, instead of thinking about our regrets, we simply experience this moment fully, the breath moving in and out, the sensations in the body, the sounds around us, the simple fact of being alive right now? The past exists only as thoughts about the past, memories and stories we construct. But this moment, this breath, this sensation, this experience is immediately real. The practice of Zen meditation, or Zazen, is radical in its simplicity. Just sit. Just breathe. When thoughts arise, including thoughts about regrets, notice them and return to the breath. Don't try to resolve them or figure them out or work through them. Just acknowledge them and return to the direct experience of this moment. This practice is not about repressing regret or pretending it doesn't exist. It's about recognizing that the regret is happening now, in this moment, as a thought and a feeling. And in this moment, we have a choice. We can be consumed by the thought and feeling, or we can simply note them and return to presence. There was a Zen student named Sarah who came to practice carrying intense regret about a friendship she had destroyed through her own jealousy and pettiness. She had said cruel things to her best friend in a moment of envy, and the friend had cut off all contact. Years had passed, and Sarah's attempts to apologize had been rebuffed. The friend had moved on with her life, and Sarah was left with her regret. Sarah's Zen teacher gave her the classic instruction: just sit, count your breaths. When thoughts come, note them and return to the breath. It seemed almost insultingly simple given the weight of what Sarah was carrying, but she tried it. At first, sitting meditation was torture. Every time she tried to focus on her breath, Her mind would flood with memories of what she had said, how her friend's face had looked, imagined conversations where she might have apologized better. The regret felt overwhelming, inescapable. But her teacher kept giving the same instruction. Note the thought, return to the breath. So Sarah kept practicing. Thought, I destroyed the friendship. Note it, return to breath. Thought, she probably hates me. Note it, return to breath. Thought, I don't deserve forgiveness. Note it, return to breath. Gradually, over weeks and months of practice, something began to shift. The thoughts didn't stop coming. The regret didn't disappear. But Sarah began to notice that the thoughts were just thoughts. They would arise, stay for a moment, and then fade if she didn't grab onto them and elaborate them into full narratives. The regret was a feeling in her body, a tightness in her chest, a heaviness in her stomach. But the feeling itself was just a feeling. It wasn't who she was. It wasn't the totality of her experience. She began to notice something else. There were moments while sitting when she wasn't thinking about the regret at all. Moments when she was simply breathing, simply present, simply alive. These moments were brief at first, gaps between the thoughts. But they were there. And in those moments, there was no suffering. Not because she had resolved her regret or received forgiveness, but simply because in those moments, she wasn't thinking about it. She was just breathing. This realization was profound. Her suffering wasn't continuous. It was created moment by moment through her thoughts. When the thoughts about regret weren't present, the suffering wasn't present. This didn't mean she should try to suppress the thoughts. That would be another form of struggle. But it meant that the suffering wasn't as solid and permanent as it felt. It was conditional, dependent on her moment-to-moment engagement with certain thoughts. Sarah brought this insight to her teacher. I'm beginning to see that the regret is something I do, not something I am. Does that make sense? Her teacher smiled. Yes. You create your suffering through your relationship to your thoughts. The event happened years ago, but you recreate it every day by replaying it, by wishing it were different, by imagining alternative scenarios. In the actual present moment, what is true? You are breathing. You are alive. Your friend is alive somewhere, living her life. These are facts. Everything else is story. So I should just stop thinking about it? Sarah asked, confused. You cannot stop thinking about it through effort, her teacher explained. That would be just another form of struggle. But you can stop investing in the thoughts when they arise. You can note them. Regret thoughts are here. And then return to your breath. Return to this moment. Over time, the thoughts lose their power. Not because you've suppressed them, but because you've stopped feeding them with your attention. This practice became Sarah's path forward. She didn't get over what she had done. She still wished she had acted differently. But the regret stopped controlling her life. She could acknowledge it when it arose, feel the feeling fully, and then return to living in the present moment. And in the present moment, there was always something to engage with. Her work, her other relationships, her practice, the simple fact of being alive. Years later, Sarah heard through mutual acquaintances that her former friend was doing well, was happy, and Sarah found that she could feel genuine joy for her friend's happiness, despite their lack of contact. The regret was still there, a quiet sadness about what had been lost, but it no longer overshadowed everything else. It was one thread in the larger tapestry of her life, not the whole design. As we approach the natural end of this exploration, it's worth returning to where we began, the simple human experience of regret. We've traveled through teachings and stories, through practices and insights. But what does it all come down to? Perhaps it comes down to this. You are human. To be human is to be imperfect, to make mistakes, to sometimes cause harm despite our best intentions. This is not a flaw in you specifically. It is a feature of the human condition. You are not uniquely terrible. You are normally human. The teachings of Buddhism don't ask us to be perfect. They ask us to be awake, to see clearly, to choose skillfully when we can, and to begin again when we fail. They ask us to extend compassion to all beings, including ourselves. They ask us to recognize that change is always possible, that this moment always offers a new choice. Your regrets are real. The harm you may have caused is real. These truths deserve acknowledgement. But they are not the only truths. Also true, you are capable of learning. You are capable of growth. You are capable of choosing differently. You are capable of transforming suffering into wisdom, mistakes into teachings, pain into compassion. There was an elderly woman named Grace who came to a Buddhist retreat center in the last years of her life. She was in her 80s, frail but alert. She had come, she said, because she was running out of time to make peace with her life. When the teacher asked what she needed to make peace with, Grace began to cry. "I was a terrible mother," she said. "I loved my children, but I was so anxious, so controlling. I smothered them with my fears. They couldn't wait to leave home. And when they did, they stayed away. Now I'm old, and they visit out of duty, but there's no real warmth. I destroyed our relationships with my anxiety, and now it's too late to fix it." The teacher, an older monk who had seen many people wrestling with end-of-life regrets, sat with Grace's pain for a moment before responding. "It's never too late," he said gently. "Not to fix everything. Some things can't be fully fixed. But it's never too late to be authentic, to acknowledge truth, to offer love without demanding it be returned." "But what can I do?" Grace asked. "They're polite but distant. I don't know how to bridge that gap." "Perhaps you don't bridge it," the teacher suggested. "Perhaps you simply stand on your side of the gap and acknowledge it. You tell them the truth, that you understand you were difficult, that you see how your anxiety affected them, that you wish you had parented differently. And then, this is important, you release them from any obligation to absolve you. You tell them, "I don't expect you to say it's okay. It wasn't okay. I just wanted you to know that I know." Grace did this. She wrote letters to each of her 3 children, specific and honest about her failures, with no excuses or explanations, and with no demands for forgiveness. She told them she loved them and was proud of them, and that she understood if they needed to maintain their distance. She sent the letters expecting nothing. What happened next surprised her. Her children, freed from the expectation of having to comfort her or deny her failings, were able to respond with their own honesty. They wrote back acknowledging their hurt, but also expressing appreciation for her acknowledgement. One son came to visit and had the first truly honest conversation he and Grace had ever had. Painful in parts, but real. Grace did not live to see full reconciliation. She died about a year after sending those letters, but in that final year, something had shifted. The relationships were still complicated, still marked by old wounds, but there was also honesty and appreciation and a kind of peace that comes from finally telling the truth. At her funeral, her daughter said something that captured this complexity. "My mother was not perfect. She made significant mistakes in how she parented us. But in her final years, she showed us something important, that it's possible to acknowledge your mistakes without being destroyed by them, that you can hold regret while still choosing to love. That transformation is possible even when you're 80 years old and running out of time." That might be the greatest gift she gave us. The Vietnamese Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh taught extensively about the practice of mindfulness, of bringing full awareness to each moment, each breath, each action. But he also taught about interbeing, the recognition that we are not separate, isolated individuals, but deeply interconnected with all of life. This teaching has profound implications for how we understand our mistakes and regrets. The actions we regret did not arise from nowhere. They arose from conditions, our upbringing, our pain, our confusion, our circumstances, and their effects ripple outward, touching others in ways we may never fully know. But our choices now also arise from conditions and ripple outward. Every moment, we are co-creating the world through our choices. When we remain trapped in regret, focusing entirely on past actions, we diminish our ability to participate skillfully in the present moment. We withdraw our gifts from the world. We withhold our compassion. We fail to contribute the wisdom we've gained from our mistakes. In this sense, excessive regret is not just harmful to ourselves. It's a loss for everyone who might benefit from the person we've become through our struggles. Thich Nhat Hanh would say, "The past is already gone. The future is not yet here. There is only this moment for us to live." This teaching is not about denial or avoidance. It's about recognizing where life actually exists. Your life is not in the unchangeable past. Your life is here now, in this present moment. And in this moment, you have the power to plant seeds. Seeds of kindness, understanding, wisdom, compassion. What seeds will you plant? There was a man named David who had been a harsh, demanding boss. He had built a successful company, but at tremendous cost to his employees' well-being. He drove people hard, showed no empathy, treated them as interchangeable parts. When he finally retired and his company was sold, David expected to feel satisfaction at his success. Instead, he felt empty. He began hearing stories of former employees who had been damaged by his leadership. Stress-related illnesses, broken marriages, years of therapy needed to recover from his harsh management style. The regret was crushing. David became isolated, withdrawn, convinced he had poisoned every space he'd occupied. He saw his entire career as a failure, regardless of the business success. What did profit matter if he had damaged so many lives? A friend, concerned about David's deteriorating mental state, suggested he attend a day-long mindfulness workshop led by a teacher in the Plum Village tradition, Thich Nhat Hanh's lineage. David was skeptical, but went out of desperation. During the workshop, the teacher spoke about planting seeds. "Every action you take plants a seed," the teacher explained. "Harsh words plant seeds of suffering. Kind words plant seeds of joy. Actions driven by greed plant seeds of disconnection. Actions driven by generosity plant seeds of community. The question is not, what seeds have I planted in the past? Those seeds have already sprouted. The question is, what seeds am I planting right now?" During the walking meditation, David found himself crying. For years, he had been so focused on the harmful seeds he had planted during his career that he had stopped planting any seeds at all. He had withdrawn from life, as if by not participating, he could somehow minimize the damage he had caused. But his withdrawal was itself planting seeds, seeds of isolation, of waste, of gifting denied. After the workshop, David approached the teacher. "I was a terrible boss," he said. "I hurt a lot of people. I don't know how to live with that." The teacher listened, then asked, "What did you learn from being that person?" The question surprised David. I learned how much harm a person in power can cause. I learned how much people need to be treated with dignity and respect. I learned that business success at the cost of human well-being is hollow." "Those are valuable lessons," the teacher said. "Hard-won lessons. What will you do with them?" "What can I do?" David asked. "It's too late. I'm retired. My company is sold." "It's too late to change what you did," the teacher agreed. "But is it too late to use what you learned? Are there no more seeds to plant?" This question changed David's trajectory. He began volunteering with organizations that supported worker rights. He offered pro bono consulting to small businesses, teaching them how to build successful companies while treating employees well. He wrote articles about ethical leadership, using his own failures as cautionary tales. He reached out to some former employees and offered genuine apologies, not expecting forgiveness, but wanting to acknowledge the harm he'd caused. His past actions didn't disappear. Some former employees remained hurt and angry, which was their right. The damage he'd caused was real and lasting. But David stopped letting his past be an excuse for not contributing positively in the present. He understood Thich Nhat Hanh's teaching viscerally. The past is gone, but this moment is alive with possibility. What seeds would he plant now? One day, several years into this new phase of his life, David received an email from a former employee. The email was not warm. It acknowledged the difficulty of the person's time under David's leadership. But it also said, "I saw your article about ethical leadership. I appreciated your honesty about your failures. I'm a manager now, and I've been struggling with how to be effective without being harsh. Your article helped me see that it's possible to be both strong and kind. So I wanted to say thank you for that. It doesn't erase the past, but it matters." David sat with that email for a long time. It didn't erase his regret. It didn't absolve him of the harm he had caused, but it confirmed something important, that even his mistakes, honestly shared and learned from, could become seeds of benefit, that his past, no matter how flawed, could inform a present that contributed positively to others. This is the teaching of interbeing applied to regret. We are not isolated mistakes. We are part of a web of relationships and influences. Our past actions ripple outward, yes, but so do our present actions. Every moment, we are planting seeds. The question is not whether our past was perfect. It wasn't, for any of us. The question is, what seeds are we planting right now, in this moment that actually exists? As this long exploration comes to its close, perhaps it's time to release the very concept we've been examining. Regret, ultimately, is a thought, a powerful thought, a painful thought, a thought with momentum and history, but still, just a thought. Right now, in this present moment, as you listen to these words, or read them, or reflect on them, where is your regret? Can you find it, actually find it, separate from thinking about it? When you're not actively thinking the thoughts that constitute regret, where is it? This is not to say regret isn't real or doesn't matter, but it's to recognize its nature. It exists as a mental construct, as a story we tell about our past, as an emotional pattern we've rehearsed so many times it feels solid and permanent. But it's not solid. It's not permanent. It arises and passes, like all mental phenomena. The deepest teaching, then, is not how to resolve regret or transcend it or even heal it. The deepest teaching is to see its true nature. It's a thought pattern, a conditioned response, a story. And like all stories, we can choose our relationship to it. We can believe it completely, identify with it, let it define us, or we can hold it more lightly, acknowledging it, but not being consumed by it. There is a Zen saying, "Before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water." The tasks are the same. Life continues, but the relationship to it changes. The wood is still chopped, the water still carried, but without the heavy overlay of suffering that comes from resistance, from wanting things to be different than they are. The same is true for regret. After doing the work of acknowledgement, of making amends where possible, of learning and growing, of extending compassion to ourselves and others, after all of that, we may still feel twinges of regret. The memory of our mistakes may still arise. But our relationship to those memories can be different. We can acknowledge them without being destroyed by them. We can say, "Yes, I did that. I learned from it. And now, what is this moment asking of me?" Let yourself, finally, be free. Not free from the memory of your mistakes. That memory may remain for your whole life, but free from the tyranny of endless self-punishment. Free from the belief that you must suffer continuously to prove you care about the harm you caused. Free to live fully, to love completely, to engage authentically with this precious, fleeting existence. Your mistakes are part of your story, but they are not the whole story. You are also kindness given and received. You are also lessons learned and wisdom gained. You are also this breath, this moment, this awareness. You are also possibility, always possibility, even now. As you prepare to sleep tonight, or as you move forward from this moment into whatever comes next, perhaps you can hold this simple truth. You are worthy of peace, not because you have earned it through sufficient suffering, not because you have perfectly resolved every mistake, but simply because you are alive, because you are aware, because you are a being capable of suffering, and therefore capable of the end of suffering. May you be free from the weight of the past. May you live fully in the precious present. May you plant seeds of wisdom and compassion. May you forgive yourself as you would forgive another. May you know peace, deep peace, the peace that comes from finally putting down what you were never meant to carry forever. The past is gone. The future is not yet here. There is only this breath, this moment, this opportunity to begin again, and again, and again. Let yourself rest now, not in denial of your regrets, but in the larger truth of your whole being, flawed and beautiful, mistaken and wise, human and worthy of compassion. Let yourself rest. Let yourself rest.